We are now going to invite Professor Judy Atkinson and her daughter Dr. Carolyn Atkinson. Both have worked or are currently working at Southern Cross University. Judy Atkinson is a Juman woman whose academic and community-based work has been in the area of generational trauma and healing. She developed and runs the We Alley program. Her book, Trauma Trails, Recreating Songlines, the Transgenerational Effects of Trauma in Indigenous Australia, is now used internationally as an essential text in trauma crisis work, and I know that we at ECAF have used that a lot. Dr. Carolyn Atkinson of Juman and Bundjalung heritage previously lived in Papua New Guinea undertaking community development work. Following her work in New Guinea, she headed a small team of a drug and alcohol rehabilitation centre in Katherine, Northern Territory, before completing her PhD, focusing on Aboriginal malviolence and its relationship to generational post-traumatic stress. Please welcome both of them with me today.
Well, we decided to do a joint gig, and I guess it's a really great honour for me to be standing here beside my daughter, particularly on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I want you to think of this now. On this land, right here, now, the first penal colony occurred in this country. Both of us live in Widjabul country, which is part of the greater Bundjalung Nation, and we've chosen to live together. And one of my dreams, when I was a young woman, when I was trying to bring up children of my own, and struggling with my own abuse stories, and trying to be a parent, but not really doing it very well, was that one day that I would be a grandmother to my grandchildren. And somehow Kelly made that happen. She bought, and her husband, 27 acres, and my husband and I live together with her now. So it's a great story. Before I move on, I've got to find out how this thing works. You work out how it works while I talk. Do you know what? I am so excited to be here when we are finally talking about trauma. I think I've been on about it for so long that I'm tired of standing up and saying we have to deal with this, particularly in Aboriginal Australia. So thank you, Jenna. Deborah, fabulous presentation. Lorna, Miranda, Richard, I have kind of thing. I've had some bad experiences with psychs, so I was kind of like, oh yeah. And when you and Warwick stood up, I thought, yeah, okay. We've got some good friends out there, so let's all work together. Okay, let's just have a look at that graph there. It comes out of my PhD. Obviously, I'm stepping over a whole lot of things. In history generally, women used to be called mad, and as psychiatric institutions were set up, that's where they were placed, and generally men were put in prison. What happened when the prison hulks came to this country? There was a lot of men on those prison hulks, and there was a few women. And some of you may not know that Philip, as he came through Rio de Janeiro, bought maternity smocks for all of the Aboriginal women on prisons, on the hulks. And he plied them with grog as they moved into this place, which is now called Sydney. Because he knew that there was going to be a mass rape on the banks of that place, as this country that we now call Australia was established. So let me just have a quick look. Can I just have a look at this so I can talk through it? Australia was established as a penal colony. Don't ever forget that. I was in Parliament House in Canberra one day and I did this slide. This is a standard slide, by the way, that I use. And the senior public servant said to me, yeah, that's right, it was, wasn't it? And I said, holy hell, where did you go to school? Who taught you? Where did you get your degree? And the subjugation of Indigenous peoples. And it is interesting around the world that all Indigenous peoples who were colonised has similar health stats, similar stats in the prison system. The creation of culturally unsafe living and learning environments, the fracturing of families and communities, the abuse of children, particularly Warwick. In the church institutions, I can't tell you how many times I've worked with people who not just were removed, but were so brutalised in those institutions, psychologically, physically, but also sexually. And there's a very big difference in the way girl children are sexually abused than boy children are sexually abused. I don't know what it is. But generally the boy children are subject to lots of physical violence as well as sexual violence. My husband just happens to be a POM. He got out of England when he was 17. He escaped from the English public boarding school where his parents had spent a lot of money to him to go. A whole lot of physical violence on that little boy's body at 5 and 6 years of age, as well as the sexual violence. The incarceration of young people, the incarceration rates today of our juveniles are immense. And the building of more prisons. I could give you the stats and I won't. But in Western Australian correctional centres at the moment, 48% of the women in Western Australian correctional centres are Aboriginal women. And every single one of them have got a removal story and an extreme abuse story, are homeless. Some of them have been banned from every rehab centre and every women's shelter in Perth because of their extreme behaviours. And it is only now that we're starting to present some programs from those women from one of my graduate master's students. Finally, I just want to tell you that I was talking to somebody last night who was telling me that her cousin works with juveniles in Queensland, juvenile detention centres. And she said to me, you know, Judy, you know why most of those young men are in prison? Because of their sexual abuse on smaller kids. It's a big issue. Next slide. Yeah, so generational. This is a really slow machine, this thing. It doesn't work. Okay, generational traumatisation. Out of the Trauma Trails book, and this is our traumagram. This is my family traumagram. So, the history out there. My great-grandfather, my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother experienced physical and sexual violence on the frontier. That's part of Australian history. Generational, historic, social and cultural trauma. And if you go down to the next generation, the circles obviously are the women. My granny, I spent 10 years sharing a bedroom with her. She was mad as she could. She was wonderful to be with. But she went through so many relationships where she was physically abused. She clearly was sexually abused. I know that now as an adult woman. She had an alcohol problem. And she had on her death certificate that she died of melancholia, severe depression. And then my dad, this is the generation where they were removing kids, particularly. In my grandmother's generation, they were taking them to the reserves. But my dad, men are different to women. They don't talk about it until my dad got old-timers. He was an old fella. And he started to talk about his childhood experiences. We were so lucky that my mum sat beside his bed. He died of heart disease, he had cancer, he had all these other things. And he started in old age to start to talk about those experiences. And me growing up, I've been working since I was 14 years of age because Dad was in and out of hospital. He had suicide attempts. I'm now starting to talk about the intergenerational impacts of trauma as that comes out in our families. And my parents were good parents. My father was a great man. I had no idea he carried the pain and the stories he carried until I was older. But I had to go to work to help support the family, and that's fine, that's good. And Dad's greatest memory was when he was about 11 years of age, lining up with a group of other men to get a job on a railway. And he worked all his life, but he had a drinking problem, and he certainly had some mental health issues. And then there's me. And I just want to say that I, as a woman, sexual abuse, outside, in the church, my mother sent me to the church. She thought that was the best thing to do. I had tried suicide, my last suicide attempt when I was 28. And I was a mum. And I passed on so many of those stories to my kids. Not because I talked about them, because they were inherent in me. and because of my behaviour. I have a very clear memory being tired. I didn't know I had postnatal depression. I didn't know at that stage that a woman who gives birth is more likely, if she's been sexually abused, to be triggered into other sorts of things. Standing in front of my 2-year-old child who had just done this beautiful drawing on the wall and screaming at her and telling her she was stupid. That's abuse. And I want to own that. And then down on further. So the frontier stuff is that there is physical violence. The epidemics, the massacres, the starvations that our people went through, all traumata. And then the structural violence of the state, which is insidious. And then the removals for our children. And the legislation that controlled us in every way that it could. And finally, the psychosocial dominance, the cultural and spiritual genocide, the cultural and spiritual genocide that controls us. I wanted to do that really quickly to set the pace, because in fact, I don't want to talk about all of the negatives about trauma. We want to talk about what we're doing. And I actually wrote to Kevin Rudd the day he was elected, and I quoted from Van der Klook. So I'm just going to kind of quote from this now quickly, because Van der Klook, I just love his work, and if you've ever been in a workshop with him, he's just an most amazing, scattered, totally intellectual person who can just get a PowerPoint up and change it while he's standing here, which is beyond my skill. Childhood trauma, including abuse and neglect, is probably the single most important public health challenge we're facing. And it's a challenge that has the potential to be largely resolved by the appropriate prevention and intervention racket. So we've got this beaut program across Australia called Closing the Gap. Hello? You know what? They don't get it yet. They will. I believe at Congress just a week and a half ago, they're starting to talk about the needs to really address social and emotional wellbeing things. Van der Klook's work. The outcomes of trauma across generations are a violation of a child's sense of safety and trust, of self-worth, with a loss of a coherent sense of self. Emotional distress, shame, grief, self and other destructive behaviours. That's children. And yet they tell us that our children just aren't coping at school. You know, that we're the problem? Our kids are the problem? Their mums and dads are the problem? Come on. Because we go into adolescence. You know, unmodulated aggression out of trauma, anger, difficulty negotiating relationships. Yeah, moving from one abusive relationship to another with everybody. Clear link between suicide, alcoholism and other drug misuse, sexual promiscuity, physical inactivity, smoking and obesity. All this came out in my PhD, by the way. I'm only giving you Van der Klook because, you know what? I don't believe Aboriginal women when they stand up and talk. You've got to have an expert outside other out there saying it too. We'll get there. And this closing the gap thing, more likely to develop heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, skeletal fractures, liver disease, lung complaints. I'll cough my way through this, by the way. And finally, and this is where I'm now going to come back a bit and let Kelly talk, people with childhood histories of trauma make up almost our entire criminal justice system. And yet we had a Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, and our custody rates are increasing. We had a Bringing Them Home report, and at this moment across Australia, more Aboriginal kids are being removed under child protection policies. Yes, for severe neglect and abuse sometimes. We still haven't got it right.